Hi everyone, today we are going to work on varnishing some teak on my new boat. I did something crazy over the winter and bought a big old motorboat and working piece by piece to get her fixed up. This is on the inside of the transom. This is where the shower connections are, and when I first got the boat, this teak was really damaged. I think it just baked in the sun. It had these really deep grooves all throughout the teak, and I took 100 grit sandpaper, which was pretty aggressive for working with teak, and got rid of most of the grooves, but there's still some, but I don't feel like continuing to sand. I don't want to eliminate all the wood there. So then I started thinking about ways to make sure I could fill up those little grooves, and it hit me I could use epoxy. So we're going to use West System epoxy with a 207 clear hardener, and put down a couple layers of epoxy first to fill in all the little grooves, and then we will varnish on top of it. Let's see how it goes. All right, as I mentioned earlier, I sanded originally with 100 grit. Now I'm going to move to 150 grit paper, and then eventually we'll get to 220. So I've done this, put 207 hardener on mahogany before, and then varnished over it. It seems to last much better than just varnish. So I'm hoping this is going to be the same. That I get a bunch of coats of epoxy on here, then varnish. And it'll be one of those things that I won't have to worry about all the time. Got a sailboat with a bunch of teak on it. It seems like that's all I do is worry about the teak instead of worry about sailing. And it looks beautiful, but it's a lot of work. Okay, finished with the 150 grit. Now we're going to move on to 220 grit and do the same thing. And then we should be ready for the epoxy. I think we're pretty good. Now we'll clean the teak off, then put some masking tape down, and then mix up our epoxy. Next step is we need to clean it off before we put the varnish on, so we're going to use acetone. Acetone is the universal great cleaner of everything, especially teak, which is an oily wood. Ooh, look at all that sawdust that took off of it. Sand and dust. Now my idea is that I'm going to encapsulate this teak in epoxy, which means I'm going to want the epoxy to bond to the existing fiberglass a little bit. So when I put the tape on, I'm going to leave about a 1/16 of an inch little gap, so that the epoxy that I put on can stick to the epoxy of the boat. My hope is that that will prevent water and stuff from getting underneath it and causing problems. So I'm going to use regular old blue painter's tape. Also leaving this, trying not to stick the entire piece of tape to the fiberglass, just to make it a little easier for me to take it off later. All right, taping is done. Next step is to mix up the epoxy. All right, so we're going to use West System epoxy, which in my mind is the best epoxy out there. It's super expensive, but it's pretty amazing. And they've got this cool system where they calibrate everything, so we do one pump of the resin to one pump of the hardener, and it's the perfect mixture every time, perfect ratio. of hardener to epoxy. We're using Special Hardener today. It's number 207, which is super clear. The other hardener typically has a little bit of a brownish tinge, almost looks like syrup. We're going to start with just one squirt of this stuff and see how far that goes. So we're going to do one squirt of the resin. Resin is nice and clear. Now we'll do one squirt of hardener. Alright, now I've got a little mixing stick and I'm just going to mix it for about 2 minutes, they recommend. Everything I've ever heard about mixing epoxy is when you think you've got it all mixed, mix some more. So I'm really making sure that I'm scraping the sides. Everything completely mixed together, and all I'm going to do is paint this on our teak and let it dry a little bit or cure a little bit, and then we'll put a second coat on. I'm going to wait till it feels tacky, then we'll put a second coat on, probably a third coat, and then when it's all fully cured, I can sand it and make it super smooth. I imagine it's going to be kind of lumpy because some of it's going to go into those crevices in the teak and some isn't. We'll probably have some high spots and some low spots. Alright, looks pretty good. I'm just going to use a regular old cheap brush here that I think is used, plumbers use it. Just going to pull it out to make sure there are no extra little hairs that come out when I don't want them to come out. Alright, here we go. Alright, now I've got my epoxy. I'm just going to start brushing it on, paying special attention to those crevices in the teak. We've got about probably 15-20 minutes of working time with this before it starts to get too thick and gooey. We wouldn't be able to use it. Looks nice. Kind of like putting varnish on teak. Really bringing out the color and the grain. Soaking up the epoxy. Usually has some of those really deep things. You get a deep thing on this bung too. Try and fill that up. Looks like the one squirt is going to be just the right amount. I'll actually have some left over that I can. Got a couple other things on the boat I need to fix with some epoxy, so I'll go do that super fast before this stuff starts to set up. So here it is after 2 coats of epoxy, and it looks pretty good. I'm going to sand it down and get it ready for at least one more coat of epoxy. I've got to sand it, or I didn't sand between the first 2 coats because I put the second coat on when it was sticky still, or tacky, and that meant there's going to be a chemical bond between the first coat of epoxy and the second coat of epoxy. This one though is fully cured, and I've got to create a mechanical bond. There are also some problems here. I took the masking tape off too soon apparently. I got drips here, 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 and then 3 drips here. I'll figure that out next though. I figure I'm going to have to get like a razor blade or something. Well, I'm going to start with 220 grit paper and see where it gets me. But I'm trying to rough this up for the next coat of epoxy and trying to smooth out any little uneven areas. So here we got some uneven areas up here. Need to smooth out. And I've you can see it on the camera, but there's lots of little uneven areas up here. Like to smooth that up. Got a nice base with varnish. I'm not going to go crazy now because I've still got to sand after this next coat of epoxy. And the way I know I need more epoxy, because I still have this kind of deep groove in here. It's definitely a lot better. I want to make sure that's filled in. So we're definitely getting there. All right, then I'm going to do a quick cleaning with acetone. Then I'm going to do some more taping, and we'll mix up some epoxy. We'll be good to go. Alright, again, we're using regular acetone. Just going to get some on a paper towel. Wipe off all the sanding residue. Alright, now for some more masking tape. I think I'm just going to do the masking tape where I worry about it dripping off vertically this time. Got the epoxy all mixed up. And we're going to put it on with a foam brush this time. Alright, so here we are after, I guess, 3 coats of epoxy. It's looking pretty good. The crack that I was all worried about over here is completely filled in. One of these bungs, this one up here you can't quite see, is not quite perfect. There's a little bit of an indentation still, but I think that's going to be good enough. So next thing I'm going to do is 220 grit sandpaper, get it perfectly smooth, and get it ready for varnish. Alright, here comes the 220 grit sandpaper. Now the idea is to make this as smooth as possible, creating a nice foundation for the varnish to go over. So that's the hope. Let's see how we do here. My guess is there are going to be some real rough spots where I really tried to get the epoxy to go on heavy and thick. So far so good though. This is pretty smooth. Not perfect though, you can see some areas here where the gloss is still there. But it doesn't take long to remove those high spots. Alright, so I just finished sanding. All the places that I went with the 100 grit sandpaper, I went over with 220 for a while to smooth them out. This is good, not great. Let's see. I'm going to put some acetone now. Clean up all the sanding residue, get ready for varnishing. Alright, we are ready to varnish. We are going to use Pettit Captain's Varnish and a 1-inch poly brush. I'm going to pour a little bit of varnish into this cup. You don't want to have your varnish container open too much because the solvent will evaporate and it gets really thick and hard to apply. So rather than brushing right out of the container, I'm just going to pour a tiny bit into this cup, as much as I think I will need, which is just a tiny bit. That's way too much. I'm not going to use tape here. Actually, I have lots of experience painting, and I'm just going to freehand it. Looking good so far. And I'm to have to put on a lot of coats of varnish, at least 4, I would say. Ordinarily, you need probably 8 to 10 coats of varnish as a base, and then 2 every year to maintain it. But the hope is with this epoxy that I'm not going to have to put down as many coats. Yeah, it's looking good. And that was plenty of varnish I had in my little yogurt cup. Finish off those miter joints, going in the right direction. And there we go. So there's 1 coat. That's 3 coats of epoxy, 1 coat of varnish. So here we are with 3 coats of epoxy and 1 coat of varnish. I'm going to get ready to put the 2nd coat of varnish on now. So again, using 220 grit sandpaper, just roughing everything up so there'll be a mechanical bond between the 2 coats of varnish. So just cleaning this up with a paper towel with a little paint thinner on it, as opposed to acetone, which we used on the epoxy. Epoxy or varnish and acetone don't get along well, so don't want to use that here. Supposedly, if you use a different natural bristle brush, like a badger hair brush for varnish, it leaves a thicker coat of varnish than a poly brush. The pain, of course, is cleaning a reusable brush after each use. It's hard to do when you're on the boat. You can't dispose of the solvents in any way. Anyway, with a poly brush, it's supposed to be a little harder to build up your foundation of varnish because it doesn't go on as thickly as it possibly could. All right, there you have it, coat number 2. I will probably do a 3rd and possibly a 4th coat down the line, but that's it. It's not going to look a whole lot much better than how it looks now. It'll just be a little bit more sturdy. So there we go. We went from really beaten up raw teak with lots of big grooves in it and sun damage. We put on 3 coats of West System epoxy with 207 Clear Hardener. Sanded it down, got a nice smooth foundation, and then put on 2 coats of varnish. Again, I'll put 2 more coats on, but that's the end result. That's the product. Looks pretty good. I'm happy with the results. Hope you enjoyed watching the video. And maybe you will subscribe to the channel and press like. Thanks very much.